The first time Karoline noticed him, it wasn't because he stood out. It was because he didn't try to. The room was loud, too loud. Voices overlapped, glasses clinked, campaign volunteers laughed a little too hard, and ambition hung in the air like perfume sprayed one extra time. It was a New Hampshire evening that felt important, even if no one could explain why. Karoline had learned to read rooms like this. She knew who wanted something, who wanted credit, and who wanted proximity to power. She was used to eyes following her, measuring her, deciding what she might become. But his eyes didn't. He stood near the back, half-shadowed, hands loosely folded, listening more than speaking. Older than everyone else by a lot. Calm in a room addicted to urgency. When she spoke, he looked up, not with admiration or judgment but curiosity. As if he were watching a story unfold, not trying to insert himself into it. That was the first crack in the narrative no one knew was about to be written. Karoline Leavitt was 24, already carrying a reputation that felt heavier than her years. People described her as sharp, disciplined, relentless. She had learned early that in politics, softness was mistaken for weakness, and silence for surrender. She spoke with certainty because hesitation invited attack. Every step she took felt observed, catalogued, remembered, and yet, that night, for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt invisible in the best way. Their conversation began accidentally, standing in line for coffee that had gone cold hours ago. It wasn't clever. It wasn't flirtatious. He asked her how long she'd been on the road. She asked him what had brought him there. His answer was simple. A friend invited me. No resume. No positioning. No attempt to impress. His name was Nicholas Riccio. He spoke slowly, choosing words like they mattered. When she talked about the campaign, about the exhaustion, the pressure, the constant proving, he didn't interrupt. He didn't offer solutions. He just listened, and that felt unfamiliar. Disarming. Almost dangerous. They parted without exchanging numbers. That should have been the end of it. Karoline's life moved fast. Faster than most people could follow. Days blurred into speeches, interviews, strategy calls, criticism disguised as advice. She was becoming something, and becoming something meant leaving pieces of yourself behind. She told herself she didn't have time for distractions. Relationships were complicated. Public ones were worse. She had watched enough careers bend under the weight of personal choices. Still, she noticed when he appeared again. Another event. Another room. Another moment when her attention snagged on his quiet presence. This time he smiled when he saw her. A small recognition that felt strangely grounding. They talked again about work, yes, but also about childhood, about New Hampshire winters, about the kind of silence that exists near the ocean in early morning. He didn't ask where she'd be in 5 years. He didn't talk about power or politics unless she brought it up. What unsettled her most was how normal it felt. Nicholas lived a life that ran parallel to hers but rarely intersected. He had built something steady, brick by brick, long before she ever stood behind a podium. He understood risk, but not the performative kind. He had failed quietly, succeeded quietly, and learned that not everything needed an audience, that difference should have been a wall. Instead, it became a bridge. When their friendship deepened, it did so without ceremony. No dramatic turning point. Just longer conversations. More shared moments. A sense of ease that felt almost rebellious in a world that thrived on chaos. He didn't try to shape her. He didn't compete with her ambition. He stood beside it, unthreatened. But reality doesn't stay patient forever. When rumors surfaced, whispers first, then louder murmurs, the tone changed. People noticed the age gap before they noticed the bond. 32 years became the headline, not compatibility. Assumptions filled the space where understanding should have been. Friends asked careful questions. Strangers asked cruel ones. Karoline told herself she was prepared. She had faced criticism before. But this was different. This wasn't about policy or performance. This was about her judgment. Her autonomy. Her right to choose a life that didn't fit the template. Nicholas saw the storm coming before she did. He never asked her to defend him. Never asked her to explain. When the weight of opinion pressed in, he offered an exit without resentment. If this becomes too much, he told her once, you don't owe me anything. That was the moment she realized this wasn't casual, because walking away would have been easier. Instead, she stayed. Their relationship didn't announce itself. It endured quietly while everything else felt loud. When Karoline lost her congressional race, the loss cut deeper than she admitted publicly. It wasn't just defeat, it was doubt. Questions about timing, about sacrifice, about whether the path she'd chosen would ever slow down long enough to let her live inside it. Nicholas was there, not with platitudes but presence. No speeches, no strategy memos, just steady reassurance that her worth wasn't measured in wins alone. Love, she learned, didn't always arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it settled in, patient and persistent, waiting for you to stop running. When she said yes to him, truly yes, it wasn't because the future looked easy. It was because it looked honest. She knew what people would say. That she was too young. That he was too old. That power distorted everything it touched. She also knew what they couldn't see. The late nights without cameras, the conversations without agendas, the trust built slowly, deliberately. This was not a fairy tale. It was a choice. And as her public life accelerated, toward national attention, toward rooms far louder than the one where they first met, she carried that choice with her. Not as armor, but as anchor. Because the most dangerous thing about love, she would come to realize, wasn't judgment. It was how much it could change you. And this was only the beginning. The first photograph changed everything. It wasn't dramatic. No scandal, no leak. Just a blurry image taken from across a room. Posted online by someone who thought they were observant. Karoline recognized it instantly. The angle, the lighting, the way Nicholas stood slightly behind her. Not claiming space that wasn't his. Within hours, the comments arrived. Speculation first. Certainty next. Judgment soon after. She read them alone, late at night, phone glowing in the dark like an accusation. People didn't ask who he was. They decided. They didn't ask why she chose him. They explained it for her. Every assumption stripped something human away, until what remained was a story that didn't belong to either of them. Nicholas didn't read the comments. He never did. That was his quiet defiance, refusing to let strangers narrate his life. When Karoline showed him a headline, his reaction surprised her. He smiled, tired but calm, and said, "This is the price of being visible. You don't have to pay it for me." But she already had. Visibility was no longer optional. Her name was climbing, her voice sharper in national conversations. With attention came scrutiny, and with scrutiny came the demand for explanation. Advisors hinted, friends warned. Some supporters went silent. Others leaned in too hard, as if proximity to controversy might warm them. Karoline learned quickly that love in her world was never private. It was audited. They argued for the first time not about politics or age or optics but fear. Her fear of losing momentum. His fear of becoming a liability. It was an argument shaped by care, which made it harder to resolve. He wanted to protect her trajectory. She wanted him to stop apologizing for existing. The truth sat between them, uncomfortable and real. Choosing each other meant choosing difficulty. They didn't announce anything. No statements. No posts clarifying timelines or defending intentions. Silence became their shield. In a culture addicted to reaction, restraint felt radical. When Karoline moved deeper into national political circles, the distance between their worlds widened. Her days stretched into chaos. Flights, briefings, interviews that demanded certainty even when she felt none. Nicholas remained steady, grounded in routines that didn't change with polling cycles. Sometimes that contrast hurt. Sometimes it healed. There were nights she came home carrying the weight of misinterpretation, of words twisted, motives questioned, character flattened into talking points. Nicholas would make tea she barely drank, sit beside her without speaking, and let the quiet do what noise couldn't. He never tried to fix her public image. He cared more about whether she slept. That intimacy, the unbroadcasted kind, became sacred. But pressure has a way of seeping in through cracks you don't notice. Invitations arrived with conditions disguised as courtesy. "Will he be there?" people asked too casually. "Is this serious?" Others asked more bluntly, as if her relationship required public approval before private commitment. Karoline began to understand that her life would always be interpreted before it was understood. When she told her parents, the conversation unfolded exactly as she'd feared. Concern layered over love. Silence heavier than criticism. Questions that weren't accusations but still cut deep. She answered them honestly without defensiveness, knowing trust takes time even when intentions are pure. Nicholas never inserted himself into that space. He waited. He always waited. That patience, earned over decades shaped by failure and rebuilding, became the quiet center of their relationship. Where Karoline rushed forward, he reminded her that permanence is not speed, but steadiness. The night she lost her voice after a long week of speeches, it was Nicholas who noticed first. Not the aides. Not the advisors. He sat across from her and said gently, "You don't sound like yourself." She didn't mean physically. That was when she realized something unsettling. The world didn't just want her success. It wanted her constant availability, her opinions, her explanations, her vulnerability neatly packaged. Loving Nicholas was the one place she wasn't performing. And that terrified her, because it meant there was something she could lose. When the campaign chapter closed not with victory but with resolve, Karoline stood at a crossroads few talked about publicly. She could harden, become sharper, less penetrable, or she could accept that strength didn't require solitude. She chose the second path, knowing it would cost her. Their commitment didn't come with fireworks. It arrived quietly, after a long walk by the water where neither spoke much. The decision was mutual, unspoken until it didn't need words. Whatever came next, judgment, attention, misunderstanding, they would face it together. The world would continue to flatten their story into headlines and age gaps and assumptions. It would miss the nights of doubt, the mornings of resolve, the way love had grown not in spite of pressure, but through it. Karoline didn't know then how visible her life would become, or how permanent the spotlight could feel. She only knew this, for the first time since stepping into public life, she wasn't alone inside it. And that made all the difference. Because once love survives silence, scrutiny, and choice, it stops being fragile. It becomes inevitable. And inevitability, she would soon learn, attracts even more attention. The news came quietly, the way life-changing moments often do. Not through headlines or announcements, not through a ringing phone or a dramatic pause, but through a stillness Karoline felt before she understood it. Pause in her body. A sense that something had shifted, rearranged itself without asking permission. When she told Nicholas, he didn't speak right away. He just sat down, elbows on his knees, head lowered like someone absorbing a truth larger than words. Then he laughed, once softly, and covered his face with his hands. Not disbelief, not fear, something closer to awe. Their lives had already been complicated. This changed the geometry entirely. Karoline moved through the next weeks like someone carrying a secret that glowed. She still gave interviews, still argued policy, still stood in rooms where certainty was demanded. But beneath the tailored confidence was a private tenderness she guarded fiercely. She had learned how quickly the world could reach for what was hers. Nicholas became quieter, if that was possible, protective in ways that didn't announce themselves. He walked a step closer to her in public, watched the exits, paid attention to details she was too distracted to notice. It wasn't ownership, it was presence. They didn't rush to define what came next. No timelines, no grand declarations. Just a shared understanding that this wasn't something to outrun. It was something to prepare for. Preparation, however, doesn't silence the noise. When Karoline's professional ascent accelerated, the contrast sharpened. Offers arrived. Visibility expanded. With it came an appetite from the public, not just for her ideas but for her life. People wanted narrative, simplicity, a version of her story that fit neatly into their expectations. Pregnancy did not fit neatly. She felt it in the way rooms changed when she entered, in the way conversations dipped and then resumed with careful politeness. She felt it in assumptions whispered just loud enough to hear. Could she still handle the pressure? Would she step back? Would she soften? She learned quickly that motherhood, even before it arrives, becomes a referendum. Nicholas refused to let that referendum define them. When Karoline worried aloud about timing, about optics, about what she owed to the future version of herself, he didn't dismiss her concerns. He acknowledged them. Then he said simply, "You don't stop becoming who you are because you become more." That sentence stayed with her. As her body changed, so did her relationship to power. She became acutely aware of vulnerability, not as weakness but as reality. She understood the cost of visibility in a new way. Every decision felt layered now, weighted with consequence. They married quietly, deliberately. Not because tradition demanded it, but because commitment felt incomplete without recognition. The ceremony was private, unornamented by spectacle. No political symbolism. No performance. Just vows spoken clearly, without flourish, in front of people who knew them before the noise. For Nicholas, the shift was internal. He was no longer adjacent to public life. He was inside it. Strangers recognized him. Commentators speculated. His age, his motives, his presence became topics for debate among people who had never met him. He never responded. That restraint became its own form of resistance. When their son was born, time folded in on itself. The world shrank to a hospital room, to breath and warmth and the surreal weight of a future held in her arms. Karoline cried, not from exhaustion but from clarity. This was real. Unfiltered. Untouchable. Nicholas held the child like something sacred and fragile and inevitable all at once. In that moment the age gap dissolved. There was only parenthood, equalizing, humbling, relentless. But the pause didn't last. Karoline returned to work sooner than anyone expected. Some praised her resilience. Others criticized her choice. The same decision framed as strength or neglect depending on who was watching. She learned that there would never be a version of her motherhood that satisfied everyone, so she stopped trying. Nicholas adjusted his life without ceremony. Rearranged priorities. Learned the rhythms of care that don't wait for convenience. He took on the invisible labor without announcing it, understanding that support doesn't require applause. At night, when the house finally settled, they talked, not about politics or headlines, but about the strangeness of becoming parents under observation. About fear. About legacy. About how love stretches to accommodate identities you never planned to hold. Karoline struggled sometimes with guilt, not because she lacked devotion, but because the world insisted devotion had only one acceptable shape. Nicholas reminded her that devotion looks different depending on who's watching, and that the only witnesses that mattered were in that room. The criticism never stopped. It sharpened, diversified, evolved. Now it wasn't just about age or ambition. It was about balance. About choice. About whether a woman could carry authority and tenderness without being asked to surrender one. Karoline stopped reading comments. She didn't need them anymore. Her life had acquired weight. Gravity. Direction. Nicholas watched her transform, not into something else but into something fuller. He saw the edges smooth where fear once lived, replaced by a steadiness that came from loving without apology. They were no longer just a couple navigating scrutiny. They were a family navigating meaning, and meaning, once claimed, has a way of unsettling every room it enters because it refuses to be simplified, and the world, impatient and curious, was only beginning to understand that this story, this complicated, quiet, defiant story, was not something it could control, not anymore. Fame doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in at first. It was recognition in places Karoline didn't expect. An extra glance at the airport, a pause in conversation when she entered a room. Then it became something heavier. Cameras. Commentary. Opinions disguised as concern. Her life, once moving forward at its own pace, now felt like it was being measured against a clock she hadn't set. Nicholas felt the shift differently. For him, fame wasn't intrusive, it was invasive. He had spent decades building a life that didn't ask for permission. Now strangers felt entitled to explanations. They dissected his past, his face, his silence. Some painted him as a figure of control. Others as a shadow. Rarely as a person. He refused to correct them. Karoline, however, felt the impact in subtler ways. Invitations arrived with expectations attached. Questions were framed to trap rather than understand. Every appearance carried an undercurrent. Proof that you still belong here. Proof that love hasn't softened you. Proof that motherhood hasn't diluted your edge. She learned to answer without conceding. At home, the contrast was stark. Public life demanded constant performance. Private life demanded honesty. Their son grew quickly, unaware of the symbolism assigned to his parents. His needs were simple: food, warmth, comfort. In those moments the world's noise receded, replaced by something truer. But tension has a way of finding its way back in. There were nights Karoline lay awake, calculating futures she couldn't control. What if her visibility outpaced her boundaries? What if Nicholas tired of being misunderstood? What if their child grew up under scrutiny they never consented to? Nicholas listened. He always listened. Then he reminded her of something she'd forgotten. We didn't choose this life for approval. We chose it because it was honest. That honesty would soon be tested. A single image, harmless, almost mundane, ignited another wave of attention. The internet dissected it mercilessly. Age became a weapon again. Accusations sharpened. Some claimed manipulation. Others mocked. The narrative solidified into something cruel and convenient. Karoline considered responding. Just once. A statement. A clarification. Something to reclaim the story. Nicholas asked her a question instead. Who would that be for? The answer was uncomfortable. It wouldn't be for him. It wouldn't be for their family. It would be for people who had already decided who they were. So she stayed silent. Silence, she learned, is not weakness. It is refusal. Professionally, she continued to rise. Her voice became familiar, authoritative. She mastered the rhythm of confrontation without losing composure. Critics accused her of being too sharp, too unyielding. Supporters praised her strength. Both missed the truth. Her strength wasn't armor, it was clarity. Motherhood sharpened that clarity. She stopped apologizing for space. Stopped diluting conviction to appear palatable. When she spoke fully, knowing that leadership didn't require permission from those uncomfortable with complexity. Nicholas adjusted to his role without naming it. He became the constant in a life defined by movement. He learned which silences meant exhaustion and which meant doubt. He knew when to push and when to wait. His support was not loud, but it was absolute. Their relationship evolved, not romantically but structurally. Love became logistics. Trust became coordination. Intimacy became shared exhaustion and mutual respect. There were no illusions left. What remained was choice renewed daily. The public rarely saw this version of them. What it saw were fragments. Moments captured without context. Narratives trimmed to fit attention spans. The age gap became shorthand for everything people couldn't explain or didn't want to. Karoline understood something important then. People fear what resists categorization. Their family did. It didn't fit the expected arc. It didn't apologize for its shape. It existed anyway. That resistance came at a cost. There were relationships that faded. Invitations that stopped arriving. Doors that quietly closed. Karoline felt those losses even when she didn't acknowledge them aloud. Nicholas felt them too, but differently. He had lived long enough to know that some doors closed because they were never meant to open. He didn't mourn them. He measured life by depth, not access. When Karoline faltered briefly privately, it was not because she doubted her choices. It was because she was tired of defending their legitimacy. That fatigue marked a turning point. She stopped explaining. Stopped contextualizing. Stopped softening the truth to make it easier for others to digest. Her life didn't require consensus. Their son's first steps came without cameras. Without commentary. Just laughter in a quiet room. That moment, small, ordinary, irreplaceable, grounded her more than any professional milestone. She realized then that success without anchoring becomes hollow. Nicholas had become that anchor. Not by holding her back, but by holding her steady. The world continued to speculate, to critique, to misunderstand. But something had shifted. They were no longer reacting, they were living. And in that choice, to live fully, visibly, unapologetically, they had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. From that point forward, the story would no longer be about whether they made sense to others. It would be about whether others were willing to accept that not everything is meant to make sense to them. And that acceptance, or lack of it, would define what came next. Power has a way of changing the temperature of a room. When Karoline stepped fully into national authority, the air around her shifted. Conversations became measured. Smiles carried calculation. Even silence felt intentional. She was no longer just present. She represented something. Every word she spoke echoed beyond the room it was spoken in, shaped by people she would never meet. At home, none of that mattered. Nicholas noticed the difference in how she entered the house. Shoulders tight, breath shallow, the kind of exhaustion that sleep alone doesn't fix. He never asked how her day went unless she offered. He understood that some roles demand too much language already. Their evenings became quiet rituals. Shared meals, dim lights, conversations that wandered without agenda. Their son played between them, unaware that his parents' names carried weight far beyond those walls. In those moments, Karoline felt something close to peace. But peace is fragile when visibility is constant. The criticism evolved again. It wasn't just about age now or balance or optics. It was ideological. Personal choices were repackaged as political statements. Her family became evidence, used by both supporters and detractors to prove opposing arguments. She had become a symbol. Nicholas watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. Pride in her composure. Concern for the cost. He had lived long enough to know that when people stop seeing you as human, they feel justified in saying anything. He worried about the long term. Not for himself, but for her. For their child. Karoline, meanwhile, was learning a harder lesson. That leadership doesn't insulate you from doubt, it amplifies it. Every decision carried consequences that extended beyond her own life. Every mistake, real or imagined, echoed louder. There were moments, rare but real, when she wondered if choosing visibility had been selfish. If choosing love in the middle of ambition had complicated paths that could have been simpler. Nicholas never let those thoughts linger unchallenged. "You didn't take something from your future," he told her once. "You built it differently." That distinction mattered as their family settled into rhythm. Something unexpected happened. The noise didn't disappear, but it lost its sharpness. Karoline became less reactive, more deliberate. She spoke with fewer words and greater intention. Her authority matured, shaped not by the need to prove, but by the confidence to endure. People noticed. Some softened. Others doubled down. But the tone shifted. What once felt controversial began to feel inevitable. Her presence normalized what had once been framed as anomaly. Nicholas remained peripheral by design. He didn't attend every event. Didn't seek relevance. His absence became a quiet assertion. Not everything connected to power must orbit it home. Their conversations turned toward the future. Not in ambition but in values. What kind of childhood they wanted to protect. What parts of themselves they refused to sacrifice. What legacy actually meant. Karoline realized then that legacy wasn't about position or visibility. It was about what endures when the spotlight moves on. Their son began to speak in fragments, half words, half laughter. In his voice, Karoline heard possibility unburdened by expectation. It reminded her why she had chosen this path in the first place. Motherhood had not softened her edge. It had sharpened her priorities. Nicholas saw this shift and admired it. He had fallen in love with her ambition, yes, but more than that, with her integrity. Watching her navigate pressure without losing herself confirmed what he already knew. She was not defined by the role she occupied. They faced another wave of attention when a second chapter of their family became public. This time the reaction was different. Less shock. Less outrage. More curiosity. The world, it seemed, was catching up to the reality they had been living all along. Karoline felt a strange relief. Not because approval had arrived, but because resistance had softened. She understood something essential then. You don't need to win over everyone. You only need to remain consistent long enough that your truth becomes undeniable. Nicholas had taught her that. Not with speeches, but with presence. As the months passed, their life felt less like a balancing act and more like a foundation. Not perfect. Not untouched by stress. But stable in a way that didn't require explanation. The world would continue to debate her choices. She would continue to make them anyway. Because somewhere along the way, Karoline had stopped asking for permission. Not just from critics, but from her own fear. And fear, once confronted, loses its authority. They were no longer proving anything, they were building something. And what they were building, quietly, deliberately, was stronger than any headline. All that remained was the question of how it would endure when the noise finally faded. That answer was closer than she realized. The noise did fade, just not all at once. It thinned first. Became background static instead of a roar. Headlines moved on. New controversies replaced old curiosities. The world's attention, always restless, found fresher places to land. What remained was quieter, more persistent. The life Karoline and Nicholas had built when no one was watching. That was the part that lasted. Karoline noticed the change one evening when she realized she hadn't checked her phone in hours. Dinner had stretched longer than planned. Their son was asleep upstairs. Nicholas sat across from her, reading, glasses slipping slightly down his nose. The house felt full. Not busy, not tense. Just full. For the first time in years, she felt present without effort. Public life still demanded precision. Authority still came with consequence. But it no longer defined the entirety of who she was. She had learned to leave parts of herself at the door when she came home, and the world hadn't collapsed because of it. That, she realized, was the real rebellion. Nicholas had changed too, though more subtly. He spoke less about the scrutiny, but he no longer flinched from it either. Time had taught him what mattered. He didn't need to be understood by everyone. He needed to be understood by the people who shared his table. Culture had a way of catching up slowly. What once felt controversial became context. What once invited outrage became background detail. The age gap that had dominated conversation lost its edge when it failed to produce the dysfunction people expected. Longevity does that. It dismantles assumptions without argument. Karoline became more deliberate with her voice, more selective with her energy. She no longer felt compelled to clarify her choices for people committed to misunderstanding them. Leadership, she learned, was not about explaining yourself endlessly. It was about standing still long enough for truth to settle at a home. Tradition began to form organically. Shared meals. Early mornings. Faith practiced quietly without performance. Values passed down not through lectures, but through consistency. Their children would not grow up shielded from complexity, but they would grow up grounded in love that didn't require validation. Nicholas took pride in that. There were moments when Karoline still felt the weight of her public role, especially when decisions carried moral consequence. But now, those moments were balanced by perspective. Power no longer felt like the center of her life. It felt like one responsibility among many. Motherhood had not diluted her ambition. It had disciplined it. The cultural conversation around her shifted too. Less speculation. More acknowledgement. Not universal approval. She never expected that. But recognition that her life did not exist as commentary fodder. It existed as lived reality. And lived reality has a way of outlasting opinion. One evening, during a quiet walk, Nicholas said something that stayed with her. People thought this story was about contrast, he said. Age. Power. Difference. But it was really about alignment. He was right. Alignment of values. Of patience. Of vision. Of the understanding that love is not proven in spectacle, but in endurance. Karoline thought back to the room where she had first noticed him. The noise, the ambition, the urgency. She smiled at how little that moment had revealed, and how much it had begun. They had not escaped scrutiny. They had survived it. They had not silenced critics. They had outlived them. In the end, their story didn't resolve with triumph or tragedy. It resolved with continuity, with children growing, with work evolving, with love remaining steady as everything else shifted. That was the ending culture rarely celebrates, because it isn't dramatic, but it is real, and real stories don't end with applause. They end with people choosing each other again the next morning, and the next, long after the crowd has gone quiet. Karoline no longer wondered whether the world understood her choices. She understood them, and that, at last, was enough.